lot of publishers kind of shy away from short stories and short story writers, but you have become, I mean, you are one of the most prominent, successful short story writers of our time. What made you decide to do that? Like, what made you want to go into that kind of I mean, you do a lot of other things, but what made you kind of focus on short stories the way that you do?
It was purely accidental. I had been doing television, having done lots of radio and theatre, and I was getting a bit stuck with it. I was finding that I was repeating myself and not getting the jobs I wanted, and not having the power I'd once had in theatre, where, you know, pretty much they treat you as God in the theatre. You know, you write a script and it's a fun process. You go into rehearsals and you tease at lines, but people assume that you're good. Whereas in television, it's just hell. It's just endless meetings of people who, I think for very good reasons, because there's a lot of money involved, and it is much more of a collaborative process. But I missed being God. And no one cares with short stories. You can do what you want because no one reads them anyway. So what happened was that a publisher wrote to me, and it was because I'd done Doctor Who, and said that they were going to ask me whether I could contribute to an anthology. And I wrote back and said, no, I don't write prose. I mean, I was 36 and I'd never written prose since school. I'd always been someone who wrote drama. And they wrote again and said, are you sure? Because we are guaranteeing you this should be quite a nice book. And I just thought, well, there are people out there I know who are like my father was, to be honest. My father would have loved being a writer and a novelist, and he would have, and I just thought the idea that I'm not even going to try is stupid. So I went out for a day and I wrote a short story, and I had the most fun I'd had writing in years. And they took it, and then they wrote me an email the next day saying, could we do a book of these? And I said, yes. And I couldn't quite believe it. And I still, for that first book, wrote it thinking this was just a side job. I thought this would be a one-off, and no one would care, no one would ever notice. And it rather accidentally that year won the World Fantasy Award. And it was up for the Edge Hill Prize, and it just began to get some momentum, which surprised me because I didn't know what I was doing at all. I was just writing stuff. There was it sounds like I'm showing off, so forgive me, but I had an email around that time from the National Library of Singapore, and they wanted to inform me that one of my short stories they had chosen had won the International Prize of Short Story Writing that year, and they wanted me to come to Singapore and talk about it. And I wrote back and said, well, that's wonderful, but I haven't written a short story called that, and it's not by me. And they said, oh, no, it is. It's on page 133. And they were right. I just forgotten because it was just a small short story, and I didn't think anything of it. I really thought it was just a bit of fun, and it just kind of changed my life. I realised that I was never happier than when I was writing short stories, even though you're right. I mean, no one wants to buy short story collections. So I have a really nice devoted following of probably 4 people who do buy my books and tell me nice things, and I always think that's great. I just hope that they don't die, because that would be awful. I mean, it means I'd have nobody reading. And the saddest thing is that my wife, she won't mind me saying this, Jenny does not really like short stories very much. When we met, I was doing comedy plays for the theatre, and that's how we met. And I think she's been rather cheated because I've completely changed medium and genre, and that isn't fair on her at all. I'm amazed she's not divorced me yet.
Wow.
So, Rob, back in the early days, you wrote a lot of plays. You worked with Alan Ayckbourn. I know you had plays on at Exeter and all of what I call the major theatres throughout our country. And that was a very happy time for you. You were sort of in charge. You enjoyed doing playwriting. How did that start? And how did you transition from predominantly working on stage to working in television?
It's odd. I was a very shy kid at school. I had a terrible stammer, which actually I still kind of do, but I find ways around it now. And I found that the only way I could really get out of being trapped by my hesitancy in my voice was if I got to overact terribly on stage, being awful, actually. And they said to me that I could do it, but I would always be pretty poor. And my only way I felt I could try and prove them wrong was this was still at my last days at school, early university. I was trying to write plays because then I could put myself in them. And I very quickly realized that I wouldn't want them ruined by somebody as bad as me, because they were quite funny. And I was writing reasonably funny plays. And while a student, the Northcote in Exeter, which was on our campus, it was a regional rep on our campus, began to be aware I was doing things which they found interesting. And then I entered, for the National Student Drama Festival, I entered a script, and it won that year the World Drama Trust Award. And it meant that by the time I graduated, the Arts Council had given us permission, the Northcote, to take me on as writer in residence, which was unusual because I was so young. And I didn't at the time realise what an honour that was. I mean, I just assumed this was the way it worked. And it meant that at 23, I was this far too young person who was put in charge of new writing initiatives in the southwest of England. And my initiative really was to commission myself, because I didn't know any better. God, they hated me, I think. And I was doing all sorts of plays. I was writing, adaptations of Dickens and Hardy for the main stage, and doing comedies and writing children's shows. And that brought me to the attention of Alan Ayckbourn. And he was commissioning me as well. And I began writing for him directly, and he would be directing plays of mine, and I was directing as well. And it was just enormous fun. And I think the honest way I can look at it now is I was too young for it. I mean, I did it for quite a number of years, and I became more and more aware as I got older that I was quite good at the technique of it, but I didn't have an awful lot to say. So I think I was being quite funny, but also increasingly I thought I was just repeating myself. And it was around the time, and I was getting lots of television offers, and I thought I would try television, which I was quite scared by. And I joined the Carlton screenwriting course, which did put me on Crossroads for a few weeks, but also gave me a connection to someone else on the Carlton screenwriting course the year before, was a chap called Chris Chibnall, who now runs Doctor Who, but he was doing his first television show for the BBC called Born and Bred. So I joined that as a writer for a year, which was interesting. It's a baptism of fire. I wasn't very good, and I was sacked eventually for being rubbish. But from that, I got Doctor Who, and I was doing a lot of radio work as well, which is very similar to theatre. So I suddenly found one day that I really wasn't doing theatre anymore at all. I was only now doing work for the BBC, and that was okay. It was an odd wake up call. I know that Alan Ayckbourn was, who I still see a fair amount of. If I'm in Scarborough, we'll go and I'll meet up with him and we'll have dinner. But I think he felt a little bit, not betrayed as such, but he always said to me from early on that he knew that every writer that he was working with, or every young writer, would eventually abandon theatre and do television. And I'd always said I wouldn't do it. And I really meant that. And I think after a while, it just became a better challenge. And I wasn't a desperately good television writer, in all honesty. I was a better theatre writer. But Doctor Who was a big thing, obviously. So,
well, speaking of Doctor Who, so you are known to Doctor Who fans for two things. I mean, you did a number of big Finnish audio dramas. And then, of course, you wrote the Christopher Eccleston episode Dalek, which is the first appearance of the Dalek in the modern series of Doctor Who. What some people might not know is that Dalek was loosely based on one of your big Finnish pieces called Jubilee. So I've got a two-part question for you. First, what was your process in adopting a Sixth Doctor audio drama for an on-screen adventure of the Ninth Doctor? And how do you feel about being, I mean, frankly, being remembered so much for that work?
it was odd. I mean, when I wrote for Colin Baker, which was a joy because Colin had been the Doctor when I was 15 years old. So, there is a certain sense in which Big Finish allowed us to write nostalgically, which I loved because I loved Doctor Who. I was a big fan of it when I was a teenager for many, many years. I never quite lost that love of it. I mean, you grow up a little bit, and you begin to kind of mock it a bit, but you always love it. And it was therefore, Jubilee was written very specifically for an audience who knew it back to front. And it was a sort of comedy, Jubilee, about the way in which we take Daleks so much for granted. It was about Dalek merchandising. It was about the idea that if we treat everything that was meant to be unpleasant as some sort of joke, eventually we just allow it to be repeated. So it was based in part upon my constant discomfort, though I love the films, of seeing Indiana Jones films and knowing that the Nazis are now figures of fun. And I was trying to do that. So Russell T Davies, who was the first showrunner, had heard Jubilee and gave me a call and asked me whether I would adapt that for the TV. But we both knew from the word go that it was a completely different audience. So that whereas the previous story had all been about the idea that everybody listening would know the Daleks back to front, we had to presume for the first episode of this series, which hadn't been on for regularly for 15 years, that no one knew what they were because the children wouldn't have grown up with them. So it was taking the basic premise, which was this single Dalek being tortured in a cell, and going in a complete opposite direction. And so it was a completely different experience. It was that sudden idea of having to write for an audience that you weren't convinced at that point would get on board. I mean, that was what was so exciting about doing that very first year, was seeing the way that the BBC changed attitude. In those early meetings we would go to for the first few months, no one believed we were actually going to make this. You'd go to the front desk at BBC White City and they'd laugh at you. I mean, there was genuinely a guy at reception once who just said to me, "You're never going to make it. Why don't you just go home?" I said, "But I've got a meeting." And he said, "No, you haven't." I said, I have. He said, "I'm tired of you fans just coming." I said, I honestly, I'm doing Doctor Who. And months later, they cast Chris Eccleston and Billie Piper, and suddenly people said, "Oh, well, maybe we'll take it seriously." And then we went to the very first read-through. And at that point, I was quite miserable because we'd just lost the rights to use the Daleks. So I was having to do another story at that point, a sort of emergency script, which didn't quite work out. Thank God we got the Daleks back. But I remember being in the room and everyone from the BBC had come to Cardiff to watch it. And it was at that point you could see them saying, "This might be something." And that was the sort of time, it was a weird shift in taking it seriously. But for so many months when we were working on it, I mean, people work. Russell said quite early on he said, "We may never get another year, but at least we can enjoy it. And at least we can watch this series back and say, oh, we had fun." And that's what we try to do. So, it was, people like Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat and Paul Cornell, people who had done Big Finish and not, but people who were these, have become really big TV stars, all just thinking, this is our chance to pay back our childhoods. So we did it. And as you say, it haunts you. I mean, that was what's funny, was that I wanted to do it once. I really did enjoy it. I was asked back a few times under different doctors. And I've always felt actually that I think I got away with murder on Doctor Who. I mean, Dalek is quite popular. And I know how TV works. I know that wasn't because of me. I know that wasn't because of some I was just very, very lucky that people liked it. And I had this horrible fear if I came back. And I don't fear this with any other form of work. I don't mind doing stories that no one likes, but I would hate to do Doctor Who again after all these years of basically getting away with people liking my Big Finish audios and liking the TV episode, and everyone suddenly saying, "Oh, you're now rubbish." I don't want to be found out. So Dalek for me, I'm so grateful in a way that it's remembered. It can be frustrating at times that, that people will assume that that's the only thing you ever wanted to do, and they will hear you've got a new book out and they'll say, "Oh," as if it was a compromise because it couldn't be Doctor Who, as if that was, as if everything really went wrong and this is your sort of way of picking yourself up. But at the same time, part of the problem, and it's true of anyone in the arts, if you're an actor or a writer, if you go to a party and you tell people what you do for a living, up until I did Doctor Who, people would not really believe you. You'd say, I'm a writer. And they'd say, anything I'd have ever seen? And you say, well, probably not. And they'd say, oh, yeah. And then they'd tell you how they were a writer or wanted to be a writer and maybe one day would do something. And you're on the same level. And if I now say I'm at a party and I say, well, I did write Doctor Who and I did introduce the Daleks, suddenly they actually confer on you a respectability. I'm actually a genuine writer, which I wouldn't have been otherwise. So I'm very grateful to that, for Doctor Who for that. And I'll never stop loving Doctor Who. I'll never stop being grateful to it.
I totally empathise with that.
It's a similar thing, isn't it, really?
It is. And it is that question. Anything I've seen you in?
Yes. Yeah.
So I know television is an incredibly complex, frustrating business. And I know how hard things can be sabotaged throughout the process of working in television and in film, and how stressful it can be. But I am curious, and I probably know the answer, but I know you're very happy doing what you're doing. Would there be anything? Is there any kind of dream film or television screen job that when you would go, now I would do that?
I am at the moment. I have for the last half a year. I've been working on TV and film things, which, because I don't want to say too much because I don't want to embarrass or annoy them, but I always knew I'd come back if I found people that liked me enough and wanted to work with me enough, but also I thought were really, really good writers themselves. And for a long time, that, I always felt too junior. But what's lovely is I found a very experienced TV writer, and we're now writing together, and we like each other, and we're in lockdown Zooming quite a bit, and we're developing things. He has a production company. It doesn't mean things are going to come off, but we are actively pursuing TV and film projects. And I suddenly find myself thinking, I could imagine these things happening. I mean, you can never trust anything, and anything can be scuppered, but it's always to do with the faith you have in the people you want to work with. And that's always, that was true in theatre, but in theatre, you knew it was a brief job. And in television, you really need to know that, and in film, that this long, difficult, contradictory journey, because things are going to be just turned upside down, has to be with people that you actually really enjoy being with. And the nature of collaboration as well is that I think both sides have to believe secretly the other person is better. And because otherwise you just get annoyed with them. And I think that in a funny way, that's what we have. I mean, I really enjoy doing it at the moment. So I'm trying to do everything again. I'm trying to get back into theatre again, which is stupid because there is no theatre. But at the moment, I'm actually actively thinking about writing some new stage work, and people are showing interest in my being lured back there, either as a writer and as a director. So at the moment, I'm sort of, it sounds silly, but I'm using lockdown as like a sort of a strange cleanser. I'm trying to sort of allow myself to believe that I could go down different avenues. And I turned 50 earlier this year, and I know that it shouldn't be a big deal, but you also feel, well, maybe I should acknowledge those things that I'm now missing. And maybe I could try and be a bit more varied in what I want to write. And why should I have to limit myself to writing books now? I do love writing books, and I will continue to do them, but it shouldn't be all I'm now doing. I could do tons of stuff and not necessarily succeed at them, but I'll give them a good go. So I'm trying.
Well, that's excellent. That's excellent. Looking forward to whatever you guys come up with.
Bless you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Very exciting. We all look forward to it. And we just thank you so much for
No, thank
talking
you.
to us.
I've had a great time. Thank you so much for letting me show off.
This week's viewer question comes via YouTube from user The Unknown Time Lord, who asks, Nicola, would you consider writing your autobiography?
Well, I don't think I would ever write a classic autobiography, but I do have a book and a title in the back of my mind, which is more of a book about life's journey for all of us, and about facing adversity and ways of handling it. More of a kind of manual, and this is my journey, and this is what not to do, and this is what does help. Kind of that. And the title is This Is Not My Story.
Ah.
That'll probably take 5-10 years to turn into a reality, but I don't think I would want to write a sort of a classic autobiography because I would just be too bored with the idea of doing it. Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess that about wraps things up. But, dear viewers, that wraps things up in more ways than one.
This is the great big wrap. This is goodbye, and thank you for being in isolation with us. We must now venture out into the world, we hope. And we wish you all well, and we thank you all for joining us. And please take care.
Thank you all so much for sticking with us during these past months. I hope you have had as much fun watching this as we have had doing it.
And we'd like to thank our silent hostess here for being so quiet, and so good and so sleepy throughout all of our episodes. And thank you for approving of all of our guests. No one got barked at. Here we go. Bye. Yes.